Hello, Brobs. We're back with the six black presidents, Black Blood, White Mask, U.S.A. by Dr. Auset, BaKhufu. We've gone through the psychobiography of Thomas Jefferson, and now we're moving on to George Washington, who I don't believe was considered one of the black presidents, so I'm not sure what this is going to entail. George Washington, the year 1776 was also an interesting year for another slaveholder and signer of the Declaration of Independence, George Washington. Washington would become the first president of the United States in 1789. This will be the same year that the Great Seal of the U.S. will be adopted. This seal would eventually appear on dollar bills and important government documents. One side shows the eagle holding Egyptian olive branches. On the other side is a pyramid with the symbol of the Eye of Heru, or the all-seeing eye, inside the cap of the pyramid. However, with this cap being detached from the pyramid suggests a nation disconnected, incomplete, and unspiritual. George Washington in 1776 sold one of his African slaves, Tom, for a keg of molasses and a barrel of liquor. The politically imprisoned brother, Tom, was sent to Barbados, writing letters. I'm avoiding reading the books and the citations. Washington also had several intimate relationships with some of his beautiful African slaves. One of them was impregnated by Washington and gave birth to an African male child. In another interesting 1776 fact story, Washington used to frequent a tavern owned by a black man, Sam Frances. He was known as Black Sam. His daughter Phoebe ran the tavern. Phoebe was in love with a white Irishman by the name of Hickey. Hickey was one of Washington's bodyguards and also a spy for Washington's enemies, the British. He was petitioned to poison Washington. Hickey asked Phoebe to serve Washington a bowl of poisoned peas. Hickeys and lovemaking must not have binded love and loyalty from Phoebe, because she broke her promise to Hickey and warned Washington not to eat the peas. Washington threw the peas into the front yard of the tavern, and every chicken that ate the peas died. Hickey was hanged. Okay. Benjamin Banneker. In 1792, Benjamin Banneker, the African-American scientist, a real mathematical genius, inventor, and the architect who laid out the District of Columbia, wrote to Jefferson, who was then the Secretary of State, charging Jefferson with violating the moral principles of the Declaration of Independence by owning slaves. Banneker's mother was a mulatto. Banneker's grandmother was white. His grandfather an African with a royal background. Banneker's mother married an African. So Banneker, being 3/4 black, was black and proud, i.e. African, and it showed. Jefferson was the first president to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C., better known to many African Americans as Banneker City. Thomas Jefferson was very impressed with the accomplishments of Benjamin Banneker, who made the first time clock in 1754. That doesn't sound right, but I could be wrong. Jefferson wrote to a friend in Paris, France, stating that we now have in the United States a Negro, the son of a black man born in Africa and a black woman born in the United States, who is a very respectable mathematician. I procured him to be employed in laying out the new federal city on the Potomac. Jefferson went on to state that I have seen very elegant solutions of geometric problems by him. Yet, 16 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, the so-called father of democracy, still owns slaves. While working as a teacher in California, a mulatto multiracial student, he is Jewish and white, said emphatically, "But, Dr. BaKhufu, that's just the way it was back then." He was referring to the preconceived notions of most whites that blacks were inferior, and the fact that many white people thought it their right to own people, so-called slaves. Thomas Jefferson can even liken the black woman to an orangutan. So this educable, deprived student has been taught well, arrogantly and ignorantly so, by his ancestors and relatives, for both his parents, people owned and dehumanized political prisoners, slaves in America. Many of these same people now spend much of their time trying to justify what they have done in the past, lie or forget it. I feel it the duty of African Americans to never forget and to remind anyone listening, looking, or reading that the biggest Holocaust in world history is the death of more than 100 million Africans during and after the Middle Passage, the enslaved trade of political prisoners. Pausing and looking ahead in this chapter, I realized that the Jefferson chapter was not over that the George Washington mentioned. Anyway, I wouldn't be able to read the entire chapter in one 30-minute video, which I keep this down to because otherwise it just becomes tedious for both of us since most people don't watch past 1 or 2 minutes. But what's that to me? Alexander Hamilton. Thomas Jefferson was also criticized by Alexander Hamilton, who was at the time Secretary of the Treasury. Alexander Hamilton is said to be of African ancestry. Also, the two multiracials initially had a friendly relationship. They disagreed on many issues and soon became fierce political antagonists. Hamilton was 10 years Jefferson's junior. He was just as ambitious and brilliant as Jefferson was also a lawyer. Hamilton was a military-minded person. Jefferson was not. Jefferson claimed to be appalled by some of the political statements and theoretical suggestions of Hamilton. So started the rivalry between the Republicans and the Federalists. Both men were probably trying to psychologically deal with the secrets of their backgrounds, one trying to be better than the other. Many people during this time may not have known or thought about the personal, not political, negative energy between these two men, said to have black blood running through their veins. Joel A. Rogers states in his many books that Alexander Hamilton's mother was mixed. In early census, Hamilton's mother's grandfather was listed as having 4 black daughters. Alexander Hamilton was West Indian born in the Leeward Virgin Islands. Native Virgin Islanders said that Hamilton was black. The most positive proof that Hamilton was of African ancestry, says a Reverend Charles D. Martin, is that Hamilton's brother James, who had the same mother and the same father, migrated to the United States, as did his brother Alexander. The difference is that James was treated as a black person because of his heavily melanized skin color and hair, but Alexander could fail for white somewhat. James was a businessman and was once refused a seat in a Broadway riding coach because of his dark complexion. He sued the coach company for serious damages. Reverend Martin stated in an article that Alexander Hamilton was not considered black only because of the general belief that all West Indians are black, but because of statements made by eyewitnesses who knew the boy before becoming a man. Reverend Martin said that Hamilton's father was invited by the government to the United States, but his mother was not invited because her skin was too dark. She would cause too much trouble as a colored woman at a white convention. Beth Tefilla, August 1916, stated that Mrs. Hamilton was too typically Negro. The magazine The Spokesman, January 1925, stated that Alexander Hamilton was definitely of Negro extraction and that this has never been successfully disputed. The Statesman had Negro blood, his mother being a Negro woman. When questioned about his birth, Hamilton said, "My blood is as good as those who plume themselves on their ancestry." Joel A. Rogers feels that this is interpreted by some writers as reference to Hamilton's alleged Negro strain. The real truth about Alexander Hamilton's ancestry, Rogers feels, can be found in the earliest and least known pictures of him. Rogers states that these portraits show Hamilton's Negroid features, i.e., hair and mouth. See the portrait on page 28. Let's take a look. Let's look. I don't know, man. It looks like a what's his name? Nosferatu. That's an awful picture. To say, hey, this dude looks black. I mean, terrible reproduction. I hope that's not the one. Drawn from life, although J. Rogers contends that Hamilton was darker than this picture shows. Rogers also suggests that we note Hamilton's woolish hair. I mean, you might have a point there, but I mean, this is the worst reproduction of a photo I've ever seen. All right. I mean, which bill is Hamilton on, the 10? I don't have any 10s. All right, what's back to this? According to persistent reports, Alexander Hamilton had some Negro blood. If Hamilton was not a Negro, he certainly brought 2 Negro sons into the world, according to the writings of Professor Maurice R. Davy of Yale University. He goes on to say that one married a very light-colored wife, the other married into a white family and lived as white. So an African man married a white woman, perhaps trying to get his just due of equal rights. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed equality, but not for slaves. Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence contained a clause accusing George III of England of pushing and coercing the slave trade on America. Chase Ribaud, the author of Sally Hemings, wrote that Hemings probably had an influence on Jefferson's political thoughts during the writing of the Declaration of Independence. However, Jefferson was forced to strike the clause on slavery from the final draft because it would have obligated the colonists to abolish slavery after gaining their independence. Chase Ribaud also feels that it probably hurt Jefferson to have to strike the cause. The confused Jefferson then turns around and argues for the ignorant position of biological inferiority of Africans. He wrote, I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowment both of body and mind. The man needed help. A genius, you say, having a thinking but contradictory two-sided type personality and intellect such as that of Thomas Jefferson's is what I've termed an idiogenio. Ingenuity was always creeping into his brain from somewhere. Jefferson was witty and creative, and he did understand that vaccinations and other damaging medications were not a necessity for healthy people who are taught to eat the right foods and to understand the correct use of herbs and herbal formulas. But Jefferson was still fascinated by the research on vaccinations and sought to vaccinate his own family anyway. An herb, the twin leaf rheumatism root, was even named after Thomas Jefferson. It was officially named the Jeffersonia diphtheria. Jefferson was an avid believer in herbs and plants. He tested and grew over 100 herbs on his Monticello plantation. He is said to have had a very unique way of growing vegetables also. Jefferson was so prone to migraine headaches and depression that he would sometimes close himself up in a dark room. His headaches were sometimes so painful that he would fall to the ground, motionless in mourning. Jefferson became a vegetarian late in life, something he probably should have become earlier. Meat doesn't do the head any good mentally nor physically. With his knowledge of herbs, I hope that he ordered himself a good, soothing cup of peppermint tea with a little ground ginger to put a health check on both maladies. BaKhufu, Notes from Herbs, Healing, Health, and Spirituality. The exact publication date is pending. It was during the Jefferson era that a full-blooded African man by the name of John Chavis was petitioned to be a part of a white man experiment to ascertain as to whether a black African man could comprehend and master a college education just as well as a white man. Of course, we know that the brother blew them away with his intelligence, articulation, dignity, and style. Mr. Chavis later ran a school for white people in North Carolina, preparing white girls and boys for college. Chavis was also a preacher and was forbidden to preach after the Nat Turner Rebellion for freedom. So, being the true genius that he was and living in such a racist society, he decided to write sermons. These moving sermons were all bestsellers. In 1831, at age 68, he journeyed on to be with the ancestors. Thomas Jefferson continued his foolish thoughts and utterances. He said, "Never yet could I find that a black had uttered a thought above the level of plain narration. Never saw an elementary tract of painting or sculpture." Jefferson's stupidity carried over into this generation. While visiting Jefferson's Monticello home in Charlottesville, Virginia, I had the unpleasant experience of listening to a white tour guide regurgitate to us tourists that Jefferson was between a rock and a hard place when it came to the question of slavery. She said that he was really against slavery, but was afraid to free his slaves because it would have been like freeing children. She said this with such sincerity. It takes a fool to stand face to face with intelligent black and white people and utter such nonsense without even a wink of "it's just my job, I have to say it." She went on to give the names of some of the slaves that Jefferson did free, but she never mentioned that they were the half-black, half-white relatives of his girlfriend, Sally Hemings. In giving Jefferson the benefit of the doubt, maybe he made some of his tasteless, tactless, moronic statements before meeting Banneker, and maybe he never heard of a John Chavis or anyone like him. It is to Jefferson's misfortune that he had never met such African people. For they certainly existed. Jefferson just couldn't see them, even when he was looking at them. Still, he went on to say in his letter to his friend in Paris, "I shall be delighted to see these instances of moral eminence so multiplied as to prove that the want of talents observed in other Negroes is merely the effect of their degraded condition, and not proceedings from any difference in the structure of the parts on which intellect depends." Jefferson proved this statement to himself by seeing to it that some of his children by African women be educated, especially Sally Hemings's children, yet they were not mentioned in his last will and testament. We have a couple more segments. Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's soulmate. As we read about these presidents, we must keep in mind that they behaved like, in most cases, and wished to be considered white men. Thomas Jefferson, with black blood running through his veins, was a man who apparently liked Africanness for his own reasons, whether those reasons be genetics, love, or lust. He is said to have fathered several mulatto children. One of his most important and well-known African mistresses was one of his slaves by the name of Sally Hemings, as mentioned above. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife, Martha. Martha's father was the lover of one of his African political prisoners who became Sally Hemings's mother. Sally was called Black Sal by the political media, an African Venus. Did Jefferson see Martha and Sally? Perhaps. In the early 1950s, two professors from North Carolina Central University, Pearl M. Graham and W. Edward Ferguson, Durham, North Carolina, subjected the rumors and reports to modern research methods. Professor Ferguson was very impressed by the only absolutely authoritative source of truth concerning the paternity of Sally Hemings's children from Sally Hemings herself. From the mouth of Sally Hemings, she has told her children their biological background, and they in turn told their children. The family history has flowed on through 4 generations. In September 1948, Professor Ferguson interviewed 3 sisters, each of whom was more than 65 years of age, and who traced her lineage directly to Sally Hemings. Through her daughter Harriet, Harriet Hemings was born in May of 1801, and these sisters had been told that Harriet's father was Thomas Jefferson. These three old sisters looked very white, according to Professor Ferrison. The other research scholar, Pearl M. Graham, has proven that Sally Hemings bore Thomas Jefferson at least 4 children, possibly 6. Sally and her children by Thomas Jefferson are listed in his farm book as Hemings, Sally, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Mrs. Graham also interviewed Sally Hemings' great-granddaughter. Graham wrote that these ladies' descent is further substantiated by the Mendelian law of heredity. Mrs. Graham also said that she was shown a daguerreotype of Miss Kenny, Harriet Hemings' daughter, which resembles many of the painted pictures of Jefferson himself, and that this daguerreotype could easily be mistaken for Jefferson himself. During his middle years, a daguerreotype is an original photograph processed by early American methods on a light-sensitive metal plate and developed by mercury vapor. Graham went on to state that Jefferson's hair was a sandy red color, and many of his African descendants had this same type and color of hair. Gertrude Harriet Kenny Watson was nicknamed Jefferson Hair Gertie. Jefferson Hair Gertie. Okay, it's an awful long nickname, because her hair was so much like ancestor Jefferson's hair. All right, Bob. I think I'll stop there. Or maybe I should keep going. I'm going to stop there. The Price of Freedom. I'm not stopping there, obviously. A white man by the name of A.M. Ross tells of the many slave sales that he witnessed and the obscene examinations of female slaves by ignorant white men. Ross stated that many of these women were sent to houses of prostitution as sources of income to white people. On one slave auctioning block that Ross witnessed was the mulatto daughters of Thomas Jefferson. Ross said that Thomas Jefferson put in his will that his slave offspring be freed, but it is well documented that many of Jefferson's mulatto slave children were sold before his death, and white visitors to his home have stated that many of them looked just like Jefferson. 2 of his mulatto daughters were taken from Virginia to New Orleans after Jefferson's death and sold in the slave market for $1,500 each. They were educated, very light complexion with long hair and blue eyes. The youngest daughter escaped from her so-called master and killed herself by drowning rather than face the type of life her older sister unfortunately had to face. If there's black blood running through your veins in American society and most others, you're considered black, no matter how many mathematical formulas Jefferson concocted. Science, biology, and genetics attest to black gene dominance. Thomas Jefferson was openly attacked by the media and politicians of his time for having an intimate relationship with Sally Hemings. Visitors to America had liberal, open conversations about Jefferson's black children. It is well known fact that a considerable portion of Mr. Jefferson's slaves were his own children. Historian Alf Mapp states that these children were the children of some of Jefferson's other male relatives. Sally Hemings had no reason to lie to her children about who their father was. But it is not doubted that some of the other politically imprisoned children running around the plantation were the children of some of Jefferson's male relatives as well as Thomas Jefferson's. Much of the history on Jefferson is written as if he were never sexually intimate with anyone after the death of his wife. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's intimate soulmate for a long 38 years. Miss Hemings was like the dark, beautiful mistress of Monticello, although one who is not of the African persuasion would have to look twice to see that either Jefferson or Sally was graced with black blood. Research shows that Jefferson never had a serious relationship with any other woman during his relationship with Hemings. However, Jefferson wasn't always so true blue. Although Jefferson had his days of Don Juaning, Literature attests to his love for Sally Hemings. Jefferson never freed her. This could have been his way of keeping Sally safe under his guarded and protective personal attention. 2 years after his death, the beautiful 53, some say 57-year-old Hemings was auctioned off as one of his Monticello possessions for a mere $50. You see, Jefferson died broke. He said that it was one of the worst feelings to have during his dying days. He was embarrassed to tell friends and relatives that if they stayed too long at Monticello, would be a burden on his household account. He was forced to sell his cherished personal library to Congress for $24,000 in order to have some cash and to run his home as he was accustomed. His library, of course, became the Library of Congress. Chase Ribaud states many true accounts in her fictional account of the Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson affair. She states in her book, Sally Hemings, that the Census Bureau listed Sally Hemings as white, possibly in order to protect Jefferson's honor as a white man. If only the Census Bureau knew the many secrets of Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps they did know. Madison, Thomas Jefferson's and Sally Hemings's mulatto son, resided in Washington, D.C. Jefferson, however, according to his mathematical formula, would label his son a quarteroon. Madison Hemings was a lawyer and an accomplished violinist. Frederick Douglass's son was also a violinist. His violin still sits on top of the piano in the living room of the Frederick Douglass home in Southeast Washington, D.C. See the Lincoln chapter for more information on Frederick Douglass. Douglass was mulatto, having a white father and black mother. Madison Hemings tells the story of his sister, also Thomas Jefferson's child, saying that Harriet married a white man in Washington City. She raised a family of children, and so far as I know, they were never suspected of being tainted with African blood in the community where she lived or lives. She thought it to her interest to assume the role of a white woman. Harriet was easily able to fail for white, even though both of her parents had African blood. Please note how Mr. Hemings states their family blood as being African. It is said that today so many young black people, young and old, try to disassociate themselves from the Africanness, their wonderful African heritage. Much of this denial is due to the continuous brainwashing in our educational system and the society in general. There are not enough parents taking control of their children's educational lives. Private schools and after-school programs are now essential. It is pertinent that we teach our children the truth. There will be a few embarrassments, but many proud accomplishments if we simply take control of our own lives and destinies. All right, brobs, that's enough for today. So we're nearing the 30-minute mark. Goodbye.